Well, we've begun discussing the cardiac conduction system for the heart. And we're talking about how does the heart organize the contraction of the muscle so that the atria are going to kind of have a ripple of contraction across them. And then the contraction will start at the apex of the heart with the ventricles, and there will be a swirl of contraction up through the ventricles. That's pretty complicated. How does that get organized? And the way it gets organized is almost exactly like the wave in a football stadium. Probably you've been in some sort of an athletic stadium as a fan, and you've seen the wave happen. And the way the wave happens is a group of people will stand up, and then the people immediately to their, it's usually to their left, right, will stand up, and then the people next to them stand up. And the trick is, as soon as you see the person next to you start to stand up, you start to stand up, and it ends up being this cool wave that goes across the football stadium. Well, these cells are all doing exactly the same thing. When they see their friends start to contract, they start to contract. The way they see it, they don't actually see it. The way they know that the cell next to them has begun to contract is that they are connected to each other by the little gap junctions between the cells through the intercalated discs. And so they know the cell next to them has reached threshold and has become an action potential, and then they reach threshold and start an action potential. So let's start the cardiac conduction system. First of all, it's not one football stadium doing one wave, it's two football stadiums. There's a group of fans up at the atrium, and they've got one wave going on. When their wave completes, then the signal goes down to a different football stadium, a different group of fans, the tip of the ventricle, and then they do the wave. The group of fans in the atrial football stadium are called the atrial syncytium. The group of fans in the ventricles are called the ventricular syncytium. So on the last video, we discussed how there are the cells of the heart. They reach the moment of threshold, not because a nerve has told them to contract, but because those cells, they get themselves up to resting membrane potential, and then they've got proteins that allow positively charged ions to leak into the cell. And when those ions have reached in enough, then that cell has reached threshold, and it'll open up voltage gated channels that will allow lots of ions to come in, and we get ourselves an action potential and then contraction. Those cells that are leaking the fastest are found here at the SA node, and because they leak the fastest, they reach their action potential first. And because they reach their action potential first, then they are going to be orchestrating the pace at which the rest of the cells of the atria are going to get to their moment of threshold, and they set the pace. So the SA node is the pacemaker of the heart. It is designed to be the leader of the band. And because they fire off fastest, they are going to make it so that the atria contract first. So atrial systole happens before ventricular systole. By the way, I did mention earlier that the heart is an organ, and since the heart is an organ, it is made out of multiple tissues. What's not apparent, even when you dissect a heart, is that the heart has got a significant amount of connective tissue that creates what is known as the skeleton of the heart. This fibrous skeleton, if we took away all the heart muscle cells, there would be this little ghost left behind that is the fibrous skeleton of the heart. And the fibrous skeleton of the heart will make it so that there is an electrical insulation between the atria up here and the ventricle down here. So electricity that happens up here in the atria, it cannot actually just spread to the ventricle, which is good, because we would not want it to be so that the atria up here, that electrical activity spreads its way down the ventricles, because if we did, then the ventricles would contract from the top down, and there's no way out at the bottom of the heart. We need the ventricles to contract from the apex upward so that we get maximum oomph out of out of the great arteries. So electrical activity of the heart, it starts here at the SA node, and it is going to go from the SA node, it is going to spread from one heart muscle cell in the atrium to another across the atrial syncytium. Remember, atrial syncytium is our way of describing all of those atrial cells that are attached to each other in that special way. And then it's only that way that that electrical activity arrives at the AV node. I want to make this point that there is no direct connection between the SA node and the AV node. The SA node spreads to all of those cells of the atrium, and it just arrives at the AV node very indirectly. Now, from the AV node is connected to the ventricles by this little group of cells called the atrioventricular bundle. It's also known as the bundle of His. And the only way for this electrical event that's happening, the only way for it to get from the atrium down to the ventricle is by going through the bundle of His. If something is wrong with the bundle of His, then there can be a contraction of the atria that is not followed by contraction of the ventricles. That's a specific health problem in human hearts called a heart block. So the AV node needs to be able to send a message down the bundle of His, and then the atrioventricular bundle, it branches into these things called bundle branches, one for the right side of the heart, one for the left side of the heart. And in that way, everything gets down to the apex of the heart. Now, while the action potential is traveling down the bundle of His and the bundle of branches, we actually don't have any contraction at that point of the ventricles. So the atria have contracted, the action potential slows a little bit as it gets here to the AV node, and that gives the atria a little bit more time to fill up the ventricles. Then the action potential zips down to the apex of the heart, and it's down at the apex of the heart that we start to get contraction. And now that contraction will spiral its way up. The ventricles have got like a lot of cells though. And so across the atria, the action potential just traveled from little myocardial cell to another. But we need a little bit more organization to get the ventricles to contract real briskly. So we're going to need a third conduction fiber. We're going to need Purkinje fibers that are going to help organize the distribution of this action potential going up the ventricles of the heart. So from the SA node, across the atrial syncytium to the AV node, from the AV node to the bundle of His, down the bundle branches. Then at the apex of the heart, it's going to start spreading from one myocardial cell to another, but also get spread upward by Purkinje fibers, but ultimately from one myocardial cell to another across the ventricular syncytium. And this is what it looks like. It's going to look like this. Gosh, this is a lovely little, is this a GIF or anyway? This is a lovely little animation where you can see the action potential and generally contraction of those cells as well, traveling from the SA node across the atria, from the SA node across the atria, right? And then it'll arrive here at the AV node. Now, simultaneously, they show you what the ECG looks like. You can see that the SA node and that contraction of the atria is creating this little first hill in our ECG. By the way, ECG, EKG, same thing. Here we go, little first hill. That's the contraction of the atria. And then it gets here to the AV node, goes down the bundle of His, down the bundle branches to the apex, and then we get the contraction of the ventricles. And all of that is this sharp stuff. By the way, this first little hill is called the P wave. This sharp stuff here is the QRS complex. So the P wave, that's contraction of the atrium. The QRS, that is the signal going down the bundle of hist and bundle branches, but mostly it's contraction of the ventricles. So this is atrium, this is ventricles. And so what is this last thing? It's called the T wave. What is that? That is all of those muscles of the ventricle resetting their resting membrane potential. So now you know about ECGs too. However, we've got a lab on ECGs that you'll be learning in even more detail. So that's it. Yeah, that's it. And we will follow up with more physiology on the next video.